Vladimir Putin's gangster pal on trial in Spain for money laundering. El Chapo's son making a deal with the U.S. government. All of that and much more on this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Welcome back to Organized Crime News Weekly. This is the weekly show where we discuss the goings-on in the global criminal underworld. My name is Kiva Dottie. Before I start, I just want to remind everyone to please like, share, and subscribe so we can help grow this channel. Our first story concerns Ilya Traber, a Russian businessman and antiques dealer who is also a longtime friend of Russian President Vladimir Putin. He is set to stand trial in Spain on charges of money laundering and links to organized crime. Spanish prosecutors are seeking a 5-year prison sentence for Traber, along with a €7 million fine, or $7.8 million. Traber is said to be the accountant for the Tambovsky Group, a criminal organization based out of St. Petersburg, Russia, that is said to have close ties to the Kremlin. And now a little bit of background on Traber. He is a former member of the Soviet Armed Forces. He became involved in the antiques trade in the final years of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union started to become more liberalized under Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Traber was granted a monopoly of the antiques trade by the city of St. Petersburg. Through the antiques trade and other businesses, such as oil, Traber acquired great wealth and came to be affiliated with the Tambovsky Group. With Traber's help, along with a campaign of violence and contract killings, the Tambovsky Group ultimately gained control of the port of St. Petersburg in the 1990s. And the Tambovsky Group used the St. Petersburg port for smuggling drugs into Russia throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The 1990s in Russia was a very tumultuous period following the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had businessmen like Traber aligning with organized crime groups to capture pieces of industry that were formerly state assets under the communist system. This led to the rise of what are now the Russian oligarchs, and Traber was one of these men who aligned themselves with criminal organizations such as the Tambovsky Group. And this period in Russia saw thousands of contract killings carried out in a scramble over lucrative industries such as oil and minerals that had become privatized since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with the help of gangsters, oligarchs like Traber acquired billions. During the 1990s, Traber acted as an intermediary with organized crime and politics, and this is where he first came into contact with Vladimir Putin, who at that time was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg and was also responsible for the city's foreign trade. In 1994, Putin is said to have granted the Tambovsky Group a license to supply St. Petersburg with petroleum products through Traber's oil company in return for 4% of the profits. So basically, Putin was taking bribes in order for the Tambovsky Group and Traber to be the sole providers of oil into St. Petersburg. Traber is said to have become so close to Putin that he has been spotted at several of Putin's birthday parties since he became president back in 2000. In 1996, Traber relocated to Spain, after which he set up a network of registered companies across Western Europe, allegedly for the purpose of money laundering for Russian organized crime and members of Putin's inner circle, especially as the United States and other Western countries started heavily sanctioning Putin along with the Russian oligarchs. Spanish authorities have been investigating Traber for the past 2 decades. In 2016, he fled back to Russia after he was charged in Spain for money laundering. However, these charges were dropped in 2018. But since then, Traber has been re-indicted for money laundering offenses, and he now faces these charges despite the fact that he currently resides in St. Petersburg. And his trial has been constantly delayed in part due to threats he has issued against Spanish prosecutors. But this story perfectly illustrates how entrenched organized crime is in the Russian political system, and how men like Traber were able to build their business empires with the help of organized criminal groups like the Tambovsky Group. Putin has long been rumored to have strong ties to organized crime, and I think this is the best illustration of that. Back in the 1990s, organized crime was running rampant in Russia, and Putin was constantly having to interact with the underworld. Traber seems to be pretty safe from serving any prison time, considering that he is in Russia. It's pretty much 100% certain that Russia would never extradite him back to Spain. to actually serve time if he's convicted of these money laundering charges, especially since he has been a very vocal supporter of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But another story that greatly illustrates how intertwined politics, business, and crime are in Russia, and the levels of corruption that have been allowed to proliferate under the Putin regime. Our next story comes from Chicago, Illinois. At 1:20 a.m. this past Saturday, in a nightclub/restaurant called the Pork Chop in the Chicago neighborhood of Edgewater, rappers Rashawn Muna Duke Vance and Darrell Youngin from the Jets Gibbons were shot dead by at least 2 gunmen as they were leaving. Another man was also shot but survived. The gunman escaped in a stolen Infiniti Q50, which cops found abandoned in a flame a couple of hours after the shooting. The first man I mentioned, Rashawn Vance, also known as Muna Duke, in addition to being a rapper, he was alleged to be one of the leaders of the O-Block street gang, which is a faction of the larger Black Disciples gang. Black Disciples gang has been around since the 1960s and is one of the more prominent street gangs on the south side of Chicago. Their longtime rivals are the Gangster Disciples, which is arguably a much bigger group that has sects all across the United States. Black Disciples are heavily involved in drug trafficking and illegal gambling, amongst other crimes. The O-Block, where the O-Block street gang is based out of, is an apartment complex on the south side of Chicago, which is a hub of gang activity and drug dealing. Both the Black Disciples and the Gangster Disciples are based out of the O-Block. Many of the members of the O-Block gang use social media and music to promote the gang. The O-Block gang is said to have been responsible for the 2020 murder of influential Chicago rapper FBG Duck, and in January 2024, 6 members of the gang were convicted of his murder. Just last month, Muna Duke had charges of being in illegal possession of a gun dropped by prosecutors. Muna Duke was only 31 at the time of his death. He grew up in the O-Block and had been involved in legal issues since the age of 14, including a stint in prison he served. He released many singles and gained a huge following on Instagram and YouTube. It's unknown how exactly the other murdered man, Darrell Gibbons, was connected to the O-Block gang. All it's said about him is that he is also a rapper, but this story perfectly illustrates how street gangs and rap are in the United States. Many people think of the East Coast and West Coast rappers being involved in street gangs, but there's also a huge problem of Chicago rappers being affiliated with these street gangs, and they use their music to promote the gangs and glamorize the gang life to people that are listening in order to potentially recruit them. But this just goes down as another murder of an aspiring rapper who was unable to leave his former street life behind. Our next story, we're going back to the Scottish gang war that I've talked about a few times already. This is just to provide another update on it. So far, 33 people have been arrested for their roles in the gangland feud. In the last week of April, Bonzo Daniel's cousin, Jamie Grinch Daniel, had his throat cut in a targeted attack near his apartment. Around 4 a.m. on the morning of May 6th, 2 cars leased by a cab company believed to be linked to the Daniel family were firebombed. Later that morning, Mark Richardson, the main target of the group on the offensive, his brother Dale, was targeted when his house was vandalized. Close associate of the Daniel family, David McMillan, was targeted again when his white Land Rover Defender was set aflame by 3 men in broad daylight in his driveway at his home in Edinburgh after his family returned from a shopping trip. McMillan, as I mentioned before, was previously targeted back in April when the front door of his home was set on fire early in the morning while his children were asleep inside. Just this past week, in an Instagram post linked to an account run by allies of Mark Richardson and the Daniel family, the identity of the man based out of Dubai, currently only known as Miami, who was orchestrating the attacks, was revealed when pictures of the man were posted on the Instagram account, along with allegations that Miami ran away screaming after he encountered men from the opposing side in Dubai. It's been clarified that Bonzo Daniel approached Miami in the Blah Blah Dubai nightclub in Dubai to come to a truce regarding the gang war, but Miami bolted up and left the club when he saw Bonzo, who then tried to contact him multiple times through an encrypted phone, but was unsuccessful. And Miami has said to have rejected any peace offering that Bonzo may have been offering. The same day that Bonzo is alleged to have encountered Miami, an attack was filmed where men battered down the door of a home belonging to a close associate of Mark Richardson back in Scotland. And that same day, a house on the same street as a home belonging to a relative of Mark Richardson was targeted, and a man was arrested for this incident. The most recent incident to occur in this feud was the firebombing of the Glasgow home of Kelly Bow Green. She was the daughter of Jamie Daniel, the former head of the Daniel clan, who died back in 2016. She is also the ex-partner of Kevin Gerbil Carroll, a feared enforcer for the Daniel clan, who was murdered back in 2010. His murder is said to have been the start of the decline of the Daniel clan. This comes in contrast to their rivals, the Lyons family, who have managed to expand their reach internationally, linking up with the Kinahan cartel, as well as aiding Miami in his war against Mark Richardson and the Daniel family. As a quick reminder, the Lyons and the Daniel family have been fighting a war with each other for the past 25 years. This feud is alleged to have started due to a stolen cocaine shipment back around 2001. And this feud with Mark Richardson and Miami is just another chapter in this long-standing feud. But this gang war continues, and it shows no signs of slowing down. I'll continue to follow it, and I'll come back to it when there are more updates to follow up on. On May 13th, Mexican Federal Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch stated that 17 relatives of Ovidio Guzman Lopez, including his mother and sister, were flown from Sinaloa to Tijuana before crossing into the United States via San Diego before transporting them to an unknown destination. Unlike Ovidio, none of these 17 relatives are accused of any crimes. Garcia Harfuch claimed this was because Ovidio has made a deal with U.S. authorities. Ovidio Guzman Lopez is the son of the legendary Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. He is one of 4 sons of El Chapo who has inherited the leadership of his faction of the Sinaloa cartel since El Chapo's extradition back to the United States. A little bit of background on Ovidio. He is said to have become involved in his father's business back in 2008 when he was only 18. He is said to have been the leader of the fentanyl division of the Sinaloa cartel and played a key role in acquiring the precursor chemicals used to produce fentanyl as well as meth. And obviously, fentanyl has become a huge issue in the United States. It has strained relationships with the United States and Mexico, as the U.S. sees Mexico as not being able to handle the flow of fentanyl into the United States. And the Sinaloa cartel is said to be the group that is most responsible for fentanyl flowing into America. And Ovidio was the main driving force behind this fentanyl explosion. Ovidio was initially arrested by the Mexican National Guard in October 2019 in Culiacan, Sinaloa, which is the base for the Sinaloa cartel. But before the soldiers could escort Ovidio away from the site of his arrest, around 700 Sinaloa cartel gunmen descended on Culiacan, attacking civilians as well as government and military targets around the city to pressure the authorities into releasing Ovidio. Ovidio was released later that day after cartel gunmen took 8 soldiers hostage from local military barracks. This event was greatly embarrassing to the Mexican government as they basically backed off and allowed one of the most wanted drug lords in the country to escape because of the sheer volume of gunmen causing chaos. But despite this embarrassment, Ovidio was eventually recaptured in January 2023, once again in Culiacan, in a pre-dawn raid at his home in a joint operation between Mexico and the U.S. military. This time, however, they managed to get him out of Culiacan before the cartel gunmen could force their hand again. He was quickly flown to the Altiplano prison in Mexico City before ultimately being extradited to the United States in September 2023. He is charged by the U.S. of conspiring to ship cocaine, fentanyl, heroin, meth, and marijuana into the United States. He pleaded not guilty to these charges in a U.S. district court in Chicago last year, but it has been rumored since January of this year that he has been seeking a plea deal along with his brother Joaquin Guzman Lopez to avoid trial. In July of last year, the Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel orchestrated the kidnapping of Ismael El Mayo Zambada and delivered him to the United States. El Mayo obviously being the leader of the Los Mayos faction of the Sinaloa cartel. He formed the Sinaloa cartel back in the 1980s with the Chapitos' father, El Chapo. And the Chapitos are said to have delivered El Mayo to the U.S. as a bargaining chip for Ovidio to receive a lighter sentence. Joaquin was also on the plane that landed in the United States with El Mayo. He surrendered, and he is also hoping that surrendering El Mayo to the U.S. will allow him to get a lenient sentence once he pleads guilty. But Ovidio hasn't officially made any deal with the U.S. government yet. The fact that 17 of his relatives were allowed to enter the United States without any trouble indicates that the Americans are doing this as a reward for Ovidio's potential cooperation. What exactly he's going to reveal is unknown as of yet. He's probably going to spill a lot of dirt on El Mayo. El Mayo is also rumored to be making some sort of agreement. As some say, he is possibly facing the death penalty for his role in trafficking fentanyl into the U.S. But Ovidio is scheduled for a hearing on July 9th, where, according to court documents, a change of plea agreement is scheduled to take place before a judge in Illinois. But I'm sure a lot of people are very scared about what Ovidio might reveal if he has indeed made a deal. Sinaloa cartel continues to fracture. The machinations by the Chapitos in the capture of El Mayo has led to great unrest in Culiacan and the state of Sinaloa in general, where over 1,000 have been killed since September of last year in the fight for control of the Sinaloa cartel between Los Chapitos and Los Mayos. But we shall see what exactly Ovidio has negotiated. I'm sure that any cooperation that he gives to the U.S. government will have earth-shattering effects on the Sinaloa cartel and add to the turmoil that the cartel has been experiencing since the incarceration of his father, El Chapo. For our final story this week, on May 9th, while carrying out an operation against illegal gold mining in the jungles of the Alto Conino sector of Ecuador, close to the Colombian border, soldiers from the Ecuadorian army were ambushed by a group of gunmen armed with rifles, grenades, and explosives. When the shooting was over, 11 soldiers were dead and 1 was injured. One of the attackers was also killed. It has been determined that the massacre was carried out by the Border Command. The Border Command was formed back in 2017, a year after the demobilization of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, which was the leftist guerrilla group that fought a civil war against Colombia for over 60 years. They were also heavily involved in the cocaine trade. Border Command was formed by former members of the FARC, along with members of the Constru, a criminal group that emerged after the demobilization of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or the AUC. The AUC were the opposites of the FARC. They were a right-wing paramilitary group that protected Colombian politicians and rich landowners throughout Colombia. They were also heavily involved in the cocaine trade. Border Command started in the department of Putumayo, one of Colombia's top coca growing regions. Initially, they went under the creative name of the Mafia. It quickly set itself up as a drug trafficking organization, controlling coca growing areas and overseeing the transportation of cocaine and marijuana shipments to departure points in Ecuador and Brazil. In 2020, the group rebranded under the name of the Border Command. According to the Colombian Attorney General's office, the Border Command has approximately 1,000 fighters and has managed to spread all across Colombia and into Peru and Ecuador, where the massacre of the soldiers occurred this past week. According to police reports, the Border Command has been responsible for shipments of cocaine being sent to places such as Mexico and Spain. The Border Command is said to have strong ties to Los Lobos, one of the 2 most powerful gangs in Ecuador that is currently fighting a war with Los Choneros that has seen the violence in Ecuador skyrocket over the past few years. Going back to the massacre that occurred, the member of the Border Command that was killed in the exchange of fire with the soldiers has been identified as the group's commander in Ecuador, going under the alias of Compadre, who was responsible for illegal mining operations and collecting extortion payments from miners operating in the region. Illegal mining has become very prominent in South America. Criminal groups have managed to muscle their way into this industry through threats of violence and extortion. Gold mining in particular is also a very easy way to launder money for these criminal groups. And as I mentioned earlier, the Ecuadorian soldiers out on patrol that were ambushed were going after illegal mining activity, which has only grown exponentially in recent years as a lucrative racket for criminal groups. Border Command has since denied that they carried out the massacre of the Ecuadorian soldiers. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa declared 3 days of national mourning for the 11 soldiers killed in the attack. And since the attack, Ecuador has deployed more than 1,500 troops to the Amazon region of Ecuador. The violence between criminal groups in Ecuador continues to increase. I've already covered a couple massacres between Ecuadorian criminal groups on this show. Ecuador is once seen as one of the safer countries in South America, but it seems that the violence from neighboring countries, particularly Colombia, has managed to find its way into Ecuador to the point now where it's arguably one of the most dangerous countries in South America. It also doesn't help that much of the cocaine being trafficked over to Europe departs from Ecuador, and these criminal groups are fighting for the right to transport the cocaine to these ports and traffic them onwards to Europe. But the situation in Ecuador continues to be dire as criminal groups grow more entrenched, and the government stepping up its efforts to quash these groups will only lead to more violence. One needs to only look at Mexico to see how this plays out, but I'm sure this is not the last time I will be talking about Ecuador and the explosion of violence and massacres that has become characteristic in the country. All right, that's going to do it for this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back next week to report on more stories concerning the global criminal underworld. Thank you so much for tuning in.